All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a massive question, one you see all across South Asia. How can you have these incredible extremes of wealth and poverty living side by side? We're going to tackle this almost like we're in a university class to really get to the bottom of why these glittering modern fortunes seem to be built on, well, ancient chains. Let's get into it.
So let's put you in the picture. Imagine you've just graduated, you're stepping out into a major city, think Mumbai, Dhaka, Karachi, and right away you're hit with this whiplash. You see these gleaming, futuristic skyscrapers literally casting a shadow over sprawling, impoverished slums. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, why? How do these two completely different worlds exist in the exact same place?
Now, your first instinct might be to call this an economic paradox, right? It just doesn't make sense. But what if it's not a paradox at all? What if what we're looking at isn't just a story about poverty, but something much deeper? A story about how wealth itself is created, how it's structured, and maybe most importantly, where it ends up.
Okay, so here's the core idea we're going to unpack today, and it's a big one. The system that produces this kind of jaw-dropping inequality, it isn't broken. It's not a mistake. In fact, it's working exactly the way it was designed to. This inequality isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature.
So, to really decode how this system is built, we need a tool, a core concept from economic theory that's going to be the lens we use to look at everything else in this explainer.
And that lens is something called historical materialism. Now, don't let the fancy name scare you. It's actually a pretty straightforward idea. It basically says that a society's economy, who owns the important stuff like the land, the factories, the software platforms, that's the base. And everything else, like our laws, our government, even our culture, that's the superstructure that gets built on top of it. And its job? To support and protect that economic base. Think about it. Property laws that just happen to favor huge corporations, that's the superstructure doing its job.
Now here's where things get really interesting for South Asia. See, unlike a lot of Western countries that had this long, slow industrial revolution, the region kind of did a great leap. It jumped almost directly from a feudal system, where a handful of families owned all the land, straight into a digital monopoly system, where a handful of tech billionaires own the platforms. That whole middle stage, where you might have seen a broad industrial democracy or a strong middle class emerge, was largely, it was skipped.
And the result is, you can see it right here. You end up with this bizarre hybrid economy. A world where billionaire tech moguls, living in the 21st century, coexist with forms of labor, like bonded labor, that feel like they're from another century entirely. The new system didn't get rid of the old one, it just built another layer of wealth extraction right on top.
Okay, so if the system is built this way on purpose, what's powering it? What's the engine that generates such just obscene amounts of wealth for a tiny, tiny group of people? To figure that out, we have to look at how value is actually created. And that engine is a concept called surplus value. It works like this. Imagine a worker creates, say, $100 worth of value in a day. The company pays them $20 in wages. That covers their cost of living. But what happens to the other $80? That's the surplus. That's the wealth that gets captured by the owner. And that surplus, that's profit. And you can see this playing out perfectly in the gig economy today. All those delivery apps, the ride-sharing platforms, they love to call their workers partners, but let's be real, it's a myth. It's a way to avoid paying for things like healthcare or pensions. The reality is, the workers aren't partners. They're managed by an algorithm. That algorithm is the new boss, the new factory floor, and its only job is to control their every move to squeeze out the maximum possible surplus value for the platform's owners. But hey, this isn't just a tech thing. Take a look at the garment industry in a place like Bangladesh, which is a global powerhouse. You have massive unemployment, which creates what economists call a reserve army of labor, basically a huge pool of people who are desperate for any job. This intense competition for work keeps wages incredibly low, and that means a massive amount of surplus value is extracted from every single worker, which then fuels the lavish lifestyles of what some people call the garmentocracy.
Karl Marx had a pretty powerful, if kind of spooky metaphor for this. He said, capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor. What he meant was that all that accumulated wealth, all that capital, it's just the value taken from workers in the past, and the only way for it to grow is to constantly feed on the value being created by workers who are alive today.
So we've seen the engine, now let's look at the results. And let me tell you, when you look at the numbers produced by this system of extraction, they are absolutely staggering.
Just take India, for example. The data here it's just mind-blowing.
By 2025, the top 1% of the population held more than 40% of the entire country's wealth. Just let that sink in for a second. The top 1%. Now, compare that to the entire bottom half of the population, 50% of the people, who together owned just 7%. What's crazy is that this level of inequality is actually worse than it was during the height of the British Raj.
And I love this table because it shows this isn't just about cash in the bank. It's about two completely different ways of life. You've got the bottom 50%, the proletariat, who go to struggling public schools and pay most of their taxes on essentials like food through things like GST. Then you have the top 1%, the bourgeoisie, who go to elite international schools and get massive tax breaks on their investment profits. One group sells their ability to work every single day just to get by. The other group owns the very things, the land, the servers, the patents, that the first group needs to work on.
And even when workers do get paid their meager wages, the system has this clever way of getting it back. High-interest loans, microdebt. It creates a vicious cycle, a debt trap. It sucks that money right back out of their pockets and funnels it into the financial system. It's a loop that is almost impossible to break. So where does this all go from here? What happens when this super-efficient system of extraction runs up against the huge technological changes that are on the horizon? Does it trigger a system error?
Well, you start to see a fundamental problem, a built-in contradiction. If you keep pushing wages down to maximize profits and attract foreign business, you're also crushing your own consumer market at home. The system gets incredibly good at making things that its own workers can't afford to buy. This is what's known as the crisis of overproduction.
And now you have to add the next big disruptor into the mix, AI and automation. We're talking about technology that could just erase millions of the jobs that have been the last lifeline for basic labor. Think about call centers, data entry, all the jobs that really form the foundation of this modern-day proletariat. And that brings us to a really, really scary possibility, the creation of what you might call a permanent underclass, a huge chunk of the population that has no economic function, no labor power left to sell, in a world that has only ever valued them for that labor. I mean, what does a society even do then?
And that leaves us, and especially the graduating class of today, with one final, absolutely critical question. As automation continues to replace human labor, who gets to shape the future? When capital no longer needs labor, who holds the power to decide what our world looks like? That is the challenge that you all are walking into.